This is Sleep Fader, where mindfulness, music, stories, and sound design come together to remix your inner dialogue, bring down the stress levels, and dial in your best sleep. Hey, it's Jeff. Thanks for being here with me in the studio lounge. If you've been here before, then you know more or less what to expect. But in case you haven't, here's a quick orientation to how we do things. First, a few minutes of conversation and music. Then I'll tell you the next part of our evolving story. And at the end of the story, relaxing sounds will slowly fade to silence while you drift off. It's a simple recipe, nice and easy. For now, we're just hanging out and getting settled in. Sometimes, we get so busy trying to move from one activity to the next, we forget to notice how we're feeling, physically or emotionally. It's good to check in with both before trying to rest. So, this is a good time to make sure that you're warm enough, or cool enough, as the case may be. You can also check in on your breathing. Try and notice. Is it shallow or rushed feeling? If so, take a slow, deep breath in. And as you exhale, notice the subtle release, a kind of softening in your body. It's okay to do that a few more times if you like. Just do it comfortably, at your own pace, while I talk about a couple of things that are top of mind for me. Words, music, and sound for Sleep Fader are written, composed, produced, and engineered by yours truly. For now, Sleep Fader is ad-free. If you like what you're hearing and it helps you rest, support the show by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you love to listen. Your ratings and reviews will also help me reach more people. Visit sleepfader.com to make a secure donation, or for more info about how and why I make the show. I had a really rewarding experience recently, one that took me back to my musical roots. A singer-songwriter friend asked me to join them for a club show as an accompanying bassist. I was glad to do it. I studied bass guitar in school, and for a long time it was my primary instrument, my calling card in Boston and the surrounding area. I've spent countless hours playing bass in all kinds of different situations. I've never stopped playing it. It's always been part of the music I make. But for a long time now, I've placed more emphasis on the guitar and all the other instruments that come into play when doing studio work. I hadn't performed with a bass in my hands for well over a decade. And I have to say, it felt pretty great to perform in front of a full house with an old friend. To hold down the low end, and to make the room shake a little. That's good stuff. The experience got me thinking, too, about how we sometimes move so far away from something that we know really well, something we've been intimate with, that when we come back to it, it can feel brand new again. Brand new, but comforting and familiar at the same time. Standing there, under the lights, I could really appreciate my role in the moment. Every measure of every song was a study in what Buddhists call beginner's mind. I had total awareness of what I was doing, but because I'd been away from it for so long, I had no preconceptions about what I was feeling, or what I might feel, or even what our audience was going to feel about any of it. I just kept playing, one note after the other, letting my musical curiosity guide me, with little sense that I was performing at all. Which honestly, it's exactly what you want when you're performing. It was a good reminder for me that A, I still love to play the bass, and B, just because I know a thing, however intimately, doesn't mean that I can't discover something new about it right now. I just need to forget about my expertise long enough to let it happen. beginner's mind leaves room for possibility. Which brings me to today, and the music that I'll play for you now. Every time we meet here in the studio lounge, I play something to ease that transition, something to help shift your focus away from the busyness or worries of the day, away from the planning for tomorrow. Something to listen to on purpose, to move you a little closer toward a beginner's mind, so my story and sounds can do their work to help you rest. This time, I think I'll feature the bass guitar, and why not? There's a first time for everything. I'll let this play for a short while. And while you're listening, try to tune in to my curious exploration of notes and chords. Follow the rhythm and the pulse, noticing when it changes, where I choose to leave space, or when I repeat ideas. All right. With that, I think we can return to the story. We've come a long way from where we started in episode 1. And whether you're new to the story, or if you've been here from the beginning, I'll offer the same advice. Keep an open mind. I'll bet you're wondering what was on the other side of that door. And I'm going to tell you. Fair warning, though. Relaying my experience might be challenging. My uncle used to say, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. Describing what happened to me after walking through that door and out of the dome, it's like that. One rainy day, not too long after moving into the cottage, I was sitting with my laptop at the 2-seater table by the kitchen window. It was my uncle's favorite place in the house, I think. Close to the coffee pot, and right next to the old transistor radio, which was always perched right there on the windowsill, tuned to the jazz station whose transmissions just barely made it all the way from the city to the radio's fully extended antenna. The station dial on that radio was never moved. Not in my lifetime, anyway, for fear of losing that tenuous connection to the music. Real music, my uncle called it. Anyway, I'd sat down to order a few things online. I'd already scouted the stores in town for cleaning supplies, a new bath mat, and a few light bulbs. I was covered for the basics, but the local shops weren't carrying exotic items like my usual brand of guitar strings, or replacement blades for my electric razor. I had started to fill my digital cart, but soon found myself just staring through the rainy kitchen window at a flat leaden sky, remembering how my uncle would turn up the radio for a favorite song, how he'd tell me all about the track, who was playing which instrument, which studio they'd been recorded in, what label had released it, and so on. With a 30-year age gap between the two of us, and sometimes twice that between me and whatever song was playing, there were plenty of times when I just couldn't quite tune in to whatever it was that had gotten my uncle so fired up about some old standard. And so sometimes he'd just laugh a little and say, "Forget it, kid. Talking about music is like dancing about architecture." He was a good guy, my uncle. Sitting in his favorite spot, I typed his signature punchline into the search field and hit enter, just to see what would come back. I wondered if it was something he'd made up himself, or if he'd cribbed it from some famous crooner. The answer turned up right at the top of the search results. Turns out he'd picked up that gem from none other than Steve Martin. You know, the banjo player. So, I'm going to try to tell you what happened on the other side of that door, outside the dome wall. I guess it really won't matter if some of the details are lost, a little fuzzy, or just plain weird. We'll dance about the architecture together, and if one or both of us falls into a mirror or gets lost in a long, dark hallway, well, it'll be okay. It's just a story, right? I stepped through the open doorway onto hard, rocky ground. The surface was covered in a layer of fine dust that shifted beneath my first tentative steps. The sky above was a deep and limitless expanse of blackness, dotted with untold stars that shimmered in the distance. It was utterly breathtaking, as it dawned on me that I'd just crossed a threshold from one world to another. I was looking out at the cold vacuum of space. To put it plainly, I was walking on the moon. Some moon, somewhere anyway. I couldn't be sure it was ours. For the moment, I could only stare at my own hands, my sneakered feet, and the street clothes I'd been wearing since Jade had picked me up, just marveling at the fact that I was somehow still breathing. My guitar case hung naturally at my shoulder. My footsteps fell naturally too. Air to breathe? Check. Gravity? Also check. I stepped further, slowly, into a monochromatic expanse that was pockmarked with craters. Some were small, shallow indentations, like footprints in sand. Others were enormous, yawning pits that dared me to follow them down, deep into the heart of the gray, arenaceous satellite. Their walls were steep and jagged, and cast dark shadows that both frightened and thrilled me. I noticed the soft sound of my footsteps then. Inside the dome, there were no sounds other than the resonant breathing light of the interior walls. Here outside it was quiet, but not soundless. The regolith crunched beneath my high tops, and somewhere in the distance, there was a steady, hollow-sounding wind. I paused and looked back toward the doorway I'd just crossed. I'd made it about 10 paces from where the door stood open, and I could still see the massive auroral vault inside. From this side of the door, the dome didn't appear to be much larger than my little beach cottage. A single story, smooth, curved walls. A large gray ping-pong ball, half embedded in celestial stone. Inside was easily 3 football fields in diameter. Out here, something I could probably climb with a running start. Looking both at the structure and through the doorway simultaneously made my head swim. I'll admit, I thought very seriously about walking back through that door, Back to Jade and Vera, back to the car, or the ship, or whatever that thing was. I'd also begun to wonder if I ever left my cottage at all. Maybe I was standing in my living room with that strange record still spinning on the turntable, a captive stuck in some kind of trance state. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd experienced an unexpected and vivid journey of the mind, and who knew how long one of those might last, or how far it could take me. I wasn't so much afraid as I was awed by my circumstances, and fairly, I think, unsure about my place. I'd nearly convinced myself to go back when a familiar figure sauntered into view, rounding the side of the dome. He walked a little lighter than the last time I'd seen him. Even had a little spring in his step, I'd say, smiling and polishing his monocle as he approached. He'd left his apron at the shop. He wore a dusty-looking pair of jeans, and an even dustier pair of boots, and under his blue flannel, a Pink Floyd concert t-shirt. 1973 US tour, Dark Side of the Moon. The old guy really did have a flair for humor. The t-shirt jogged a memory. Something about the boats in the harbor back home. I grasped at the vision, but it winked away, a firefly I couldn't catch. The shopkeep stood in front of me, popped his monocle into his left eye, and, for a second time, laid a gentle hand on my shoulder. Then he did something truly unexpected. He said, "Glad you could make it." The shopkeep's voice was deep, musical, and a little raspy, like the bowed strings of a cello. I was shocked to hear him speak at all. I had assumed he either couldn't or preferred not to. I was full of questions, but the feelings of uncertainty had passed for the moment. I looked back through the open doorway one more time, then followed the shopkeep as he led me away from the dome and out into the cratered landscape. He walked slowly, just strolling along as if we were cruising the boardwalk. He seemed to be leading us toward one of the larger basins. I couldn't tell how near or far it was. My perspective was unreliable at best. I wanted to know why he hadn't spoken on the night we met, and why he was speaking now. He kept walking and asked me why that was so important. I said I wasn't sure that it was. I asked him if this was our moon, and he told me no. It was not the moon that I knew, but it was similar in some ways, different in many others. I asked whether this moon was orbiting another planet, like ours, and would we be able to see it from here? He didn't answer that one. I asked him why. Why did he want me to come here? How was it that we were talking, breathing, walking? How was any of this possible? The shopkeep stopped, pulled his crimson rag from his front pocket, and once again began polishing the monocle, eyeing me curiously. Finally, he spoke. "That word, possible, what does it mean to you, really? Is it a fixed idea? I don't think that it is.
If possibility were a static thing, a truly knowable thing, we wouldn't spend very much time trying to learn what's possible and what's not, would we?
This time, I was the one without an answer. He moved to continue walking, but I had one more question. I asked for his name. He stopped his polishing and put both the rag and the monocle into the front pocket of his jeans. Then he made a sound that I couldn't hope to reproduce. There were syllables, and there were tones, and a rushing sound like water, and something that sounded like brushes on a snare drum at the end. He told me that it was probably simpler to just keep thinking of him as the shopkeep. That was close enough, he said. Odd though, I couldn't remember having ever mentioned my little nickname for him. By now you should be pretty impressed with how easily I was rolling with all of this. Either that, or you're just not buying it, which would be forgivable. We're doing an architectural jitterbug right now, you and I. Dancing around the unlikely, doing our best to keep time with cynicism, while trying not to step on the delicate toes of the conceivable. This being only my second encounter with the shopkeep, I was just beginning to grasp that there was something terrifically soothing about him. That just being near him somehow promoted in me the ability to let go of my nagging hubris and accept and observe the moment for what it was. I understood that the shopkeep was different from me. From everyone, maybe. And I was pretty convinced that as long as I was with him, I was safe, wandering that unfamiliar moon. I was free to accept things as they were, and things were pretty interesting. We walked silently together for a while, him leading the way on the alien shore of a crater the size of Boston. The two of us held firm to the surface by impossible gravity and breathing impossible air. My many questions fell quiet as my curiosity opened wide, and wider still, spreading outward, a cloak of stars unfolding to mirror the infinity of sparkling darkness overhead. In some places, the surface was cracked and fractured, as though the ground beneath could give way at any moment. There was a dark and exotic beauty in the desolation, a sense of breathtaking majesty that filled me with both wonder and terror in equal measure. Mammoth spherical formations dotted the landscape, some only half-visible domes, others balanced on their vertices, each one miles from the other, perfectly smooth and round, polished to perfection by some unknown force. To my imagination, which was operating on hyperdrive at the moment, they resembled great game pieces, strategically placed by mountainous players. I longed for an aerial view to see if I could notice a pattern in their positions. I wondered, did each of these colossal spheres have its own doorway to this moon? Some were half submerged, resembling the dome I had just exited. Had the others just landed or emerged? And the scale of them, my dome had been tiny by comparison, which belied its cavernous interior. What must the insides of these much larger domes be like? Indeed, my questions were piling up once again, but with little urgency. I was too wowed to worry. I considered my dome again. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that it was mine. I decided that it was some kind of passage, a place out of place, which meant that maybe those titanic spheres in the distance were passages too, gateways to other parts of my world, or possibly other worlds. The shopkeep kept walking, and I followed. That hollow-sounding wind was louder now as we approached the rim of the Great Basin. continued our gentle pace, the shopkeep and I. Unable to help myself, I asked more questions. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. We walked, and always my eyes were drawn toward those great distant spheres and domes as I tried to accept their presence, to come to terms with what they might be. They could be vessels of some sort, landing or emerging. Passageways to other worlds. Grand pieces in some unremitting, super-terrestrial game, too multifaceted for me to comprehend. Or simply natural formations, unconcerned with my need for labels or rationale. As we walked further, the chalky regolith gradually changed in color and texture. Soft orange and purple hues blended like watercolors into ground that felt increasingly more fertile and organic. Small patches of violet moss sprouted here and there, gradually growing in size and quantity, until they merged to form a lush carpet of vegetation within which tall stalks of iridescent grass swayed in a breeze that I could hear but could not feel on my skin. The air had grown warmer, too, and carried an earthy floral scent that was comforting and familiar. We'd reached the shore of the Great Basin now, within only a few yards of the very edge. Coils of silky mist spilled up and over the rim and spread out over the plush lavender matting. I stood facing the great crater's horizon, over a dense sea of undulant vapor, breathing along with it as it rose and fell, gently up and down. I watched as the shopkeep took his monocle from his eye, gave it a cursory polish with the crimson cloth before detaching it from its silver chain. Then, with surprising limberness and fluidity, he cast it far into the mist where it skipped over the surface and over a great distance as I counted 5, 10, 15 vaults until it disappeared out of sight. At each point of contact with the vaporous cloud, concentric circles of light rippled outward and intersected with each other to form a complex, glowing mandala. The pattern held briefly, then each of the hundreds of rings uncoiled themselves and slithered away serpent-like into the unknowable depths of the Great Basin. It was a beautiful and intoxicating display. I had a moment to wonder how the shopkeep would get by without his habitual eyepiece, before he grinned at me, reached into the pocket of his jeans, and withdrew an identical glass lens. He attached it to the silver chain and began his polishing anew. We resumed our walking along the smoky crater's shoreline, slow and relaxed. That distant tonal wind filling the silence, perhaps sending more unanswerable questions out into the cosmic void. And then, ahead of us, too distant to be seen clearly, but close enough that I could discern their forms, I saw two figures moving in our direction. One was tall, and appeared to glide effortlessly in long regal strides. The other was smaller, and moved more buoyantly by the side of their companion. I looked toward the shopkeep to gauge his impressions, but I could find no trace or sign of him. He had vanished, if he had ever been there at all. Again, I looked back, scanning the alien terrain for the path back to my dome, to my doorway to Jade and Vera, and back to my cottage. But there was no sense of urgency, no fear or doubt. Only that ever-expanding, thirsty curiosity and a notion that just up ahead were answers. Maybe. Or maybe more questions. Either way, as it had become my habit lately, I looped a thumb under the strap of my guitar case and just kept walking.